What if Hoid was never in the Stormlight archive? Welcome, World Hoppers. Today I want to explore a possible alternative scenario in the Stormlight archive to examine how much of an impact Hoid, or Wit as he often goes by on Roshar, had on the overall story, and what would have happened if he wasn't there at all. Now, before I get started, let me establish some ground rules for how I'm analyzing this alternative version of the Stormlight archive. First, there may be spoilers for any and all Cosmere books written by Brandon Sanderson, though I doubt there will be anything spoiled here really outside the main Stormlight books. Second, anything that Hoid or Wit may have been involved with on Roshar before the events of the Way of Kings, we will still consider to have happened. So whatever influence he had when humans first arrived to Roshar thousands of years ago, all the way up to his relationship mentoring Sigil as an apprentice, all of that still happened in this alternative version of the story. The only thing that's changed is he is no longer there in any scene he was during the Way of Kings and beyond. Third, I've done my best to review all of the scenes Wit was in, as well as considered how his absence may have affected characters and plot lines throughout all of the books. That said, of course, it's possible that I may have missed something. There may be something important that happened that I overlooked, or something unimportant that I placed too much emphasis on. That's fine. Let me know in comments what you think would have gone down differently. This is just for fun, so I would definitely love to hear your thoughts. And finally, if you appreciate Cosmere videos like this, make sure to like this video or subscribe to Kolos Learns to Read. I appreciate it. It helps the channel out a ton. And that said, let's get started. So in the Way of Kings, we meet Hoid, who goes by Wit, and while he shows up a decent amount to insult various Alethi nobility, stick up for a few others, notably Renarin, and give Dalinar a few heads up about the ongoings at some feasts, I didn't find any of those actions to ultimately have made any real difference in how things turned out. There was, however, one moment when Kaladin wandered off from the members of Bridge 4, where he meets Wit, and where Wit tells him the story of Dorethi and the Wandersail, which helps push Kaladin towards the mind state that people are responsible for the evil done in their name, even if they did not intend it. And this concept pushes Kaladin to think about responsibility in a larger way, nudging him ever so slightly from I protect people directly in front of me toward I am responsible for what happens to people if I have the power to stop it. Now that shift is subtle, but it matters for a later decision when Kaladin has the opportunity to abandon Dalinar and his army to escape and become free of slavery with the rest of Bridge 4. But of course, ultimately, he decides to risk everything in order to save Dalinar and his men from Sadeas's betrayal. Now, if Wit hadn't have told Kaladin the Wandersail story, would Kaladin actually have left Dalinar to die? Realistically, probably not, though the decision might have been a little harder. There were still a few other factors that I think would have still pushed Kaladin towards saving Dalinar. One is that Kaladin, if nothing else, is built from honor in his core, and with Syl alongside him, I don't think he could have made the choice to willingly abandon men to their deaths if he could save them. The other is that Kaladin also hates the idea of watching soldiers be betrayed, and with this scenario of Sadeas betraying Dalinar, that echoes very closely with Kaladin's own experience with Amaram's betrayal. So I think that realistically, while Wit's Wandersail story helped nudge Kaladin in the right direction, I think the Way of Kings really would have played out exactly the same way even if Wit had never been there. Then in the second book, The Words of Radiance, Wit plays a sort of similar role. Again, he meets with Kaladin, this time after he's been arrested, and this time telling the story of Fleet, which is really meant to help Kaladin reflect on what's actually important, because at this point, Kaladin is full on pissed off at the Light Eyes and really not down to help protect them any longer. But the thing is, I'm not sure this story had a huge overall effect on Kaladin, because even just a few chapters later, he outright concludes to himself that Moash is right and that Elhokar should be killed. Of course, Kaladin changes his mind when it counts, and Wit's story may have done a little to help that. I just really think it's part of Kaladin's DNA and character at this point that he can't help but take the honorable route when the moment to make a decision actually comes. And so whether Wit had visited him in jail or not, the outcome, I believe, would again have been the same. Then later on, Wit also has a meaningful talk with Dalinar, subtly encouraging him to take control without continuing to second guess himself. Quote, "Do not sorrow," Wit said. "It is an era for tyrants. I doubt this place is ready for anything more, and a benevolent tyrant is preferable to the disaster of weak rule. Perhaps in another place and time, I'd have denounced you with spit and bile. Here today, I praise you as what this world needs. But Wit's influence on Dalinar isn't huge, and while the conversation may have been helpful, I really don't see it as having enough of an influence on Dalinar to have changed anything at all had it not happened. We also see at the very end of Words of Radiance that Wit comes and meets Yasna as she finally escapes from Shadesmar, where she was trapped for a bit after almost being killed by Ghostbloods on her trip with Shallan. And this is really the beginning of where Wit starts to make some decisions and do some things that I believe does alter the course of the Stormlight Archive. But it takes longer than I thought it would. Now, speaking of the Stormlight Archive, if you want to have a mini magnet version of the entire series, make sure to check out my store in the link below. I put these together myself, and they're an awesome way to decorate your fridge, give as a gift to a fellow world hopper, and help support the channel. You can choose from the Stormlight Archive, Mistborn Eras 1 or 2, the standalone books, and even the entire collection. Okay, so moving on to Oathbringer. Yasna arrives in Urithiru with Wit and now has a much better sense of the overall Cosmere and even knows about the true events surrounding the Recreants. Quote, "We must tell the others what we learned from Wit, Ivory. Eventually, this secret must be known." Yasna, no. It would be the end. Another Recreants. "The truth has not destroyed me. You are special. No knowledge is that can destroy you, but the others." She held his eyes, then gathered the sheets stacked beside her. "We shall see," she said. Now, the truth for the cause of the Recreants does eventually come out, but not from Yasna. So her earlier knowledge about this really doesn't seem to have much of an effect. So again, while internally things might have been different from Yasna, ultimately the outcome would have been exactly the same. Now, Wit also meets with Shallan while she's infiltrating Kholinar, and this is sort of where Shallan, as Vale, ends up giving food away to some of the poor instead of the cult in order to attract their attention, and then learns that rumors throughout the city are saying that she wants to join the cult. And this is actually what Wit has been doing in the background. And this allows Shallan to sort of gain access to that cult party where she feels the effects of the Unmade, and then after is so shaken up from that experience that instead of going home, she heads to give the rest of her stored food to the homeless man Grund. And this leads to a series of events to which Shallan ends up seeing Grund murdered because of the food, which she feels is her fault and really starts to send her in a bad place mentally. So if Wit wasn't there, this probably would not have happened. I mean, Grund would have still been killed, but Shallan probably wouldn't have been there while it happened, and so she would have never had any way of knowing that it was due to her actions. So things might have gone differently. However, then Wit visits Shallan and tells her the story of the girl who looked up. And through this story, Wit expresses to Shallan that yes, the world is a terrible place, but Shallan is not terrible because of it, and the world is still better for her presence in it. And that does a lot to help Shallan get out of her funk. So Wit sort of creates and counters his own actions here. His first series of actions leading Shallan to unfortunately witness Grund being killed and being torn apart from it, and then his next series of actions helping her feel better about what she was doing. So whether he was there or not, again, there still doesn't seem to be, at least to me, any significant effect one way or the other of having Wit in the story. And so at this point, I was pretty shocked because in my mind, I thought Wit had a bigger impact than he did. And then heading into the fourth book, I began questioning myself, like maybe Brandon wrote Wit in a way that he really doesn't have much of an effect on the story. But no, not at all. Things change drastically in Book 4, Rhythm of War. In fact, without Wit, there are 3 huge potential shakeups that changes everything in the Stormlight Archive. Arguably, in this book, Wit changes the entire state of the Cosmere. The first and arguably least impactful of the 3 is how Wit affects Kaladin's storylines. So in Rhythm of War, you might remember that Urithiru gets taken over, with only a few Radiants still able to do anything about it. But mostly everything here relies on Kaladin being able to save the sibling, Navani, and free the Radiants. And during this, Odium, through Kaladin's connection with Moash, sends Kaladin into these sort of nightmare visions to mentally break him. And it seems to be working. Now, Wit enters these visions as well to help Kaladin by telling the story of the dog and the dragon. which helps Kaladin realize he is making unreasonable expectations of himself, and that although he will have hard times, even harder times than this, there will be other days that will be better. And it's just a huge pivotal moment that helps propel Kaladin forward to do almost the impossible and save the tower and the Radiance. And it could be argued that without wit, Kaladin would have been too broken from these visions of Odium to be able to do so. But again, while it certainly helped to have wit give Kaladin this boost, I think with Teft and Dabbid still there with Kaladin, the fact that he wasn't alone, I like to believe that he would have been able to push through Odium's influence and still do what he needed to do to save his friends. I really do. But it honestly could have gone either way, and so far out of everything discussed, this had the biggest potential to where the absence of wit would have changed everything in a very drastic way. The second huge influence wit had in this book is with Shallan, through his communication to Shallan's Spren pattern. So while Shallan and Adolin travel through Shadesmar to the Honor Spren home city of lasting integrity, Shallan is given a communication cube from Mraize, the supposed leader as far as Shallan knows at this point of the Ghostbloods. The communication cube, as we find out, is a Scion, and there's this big ongoing storyline where Shallan can't figure out who on her team is using this cube behind her back, but none of that would have happened without wit, because as we find out, it was actually Pattern using it all along behind Shallan's back to communicate with wit. Now, why this is important is because at the same time, Shallan is slowly losing herself to another identity, Formless. And one of her duties from Mraize in Lasting Integrity is to capture Astaris, aka the Herald Kalax, soul, and a gemstone. And on the way to Kalax's house, Pattern catches up with Shallan to deliver a message from wit. The message being that Shallan deserves to be trusted and loved. Now, Shallan as Formless still enters, but I believe hesitates because of that message just enough that Vale is able to confront Formless, but had there been no wit, I think there would have been no hesitation. She would have more quickly captured Rostaris, taken his form with light weaving, pretended to be him for the final day of the trial, and then she would have proclaimed Adolin innocent, but having fully committed to Formless to the point of no return. And I believe at this point she would have left Adolin and the Radiance and joined the Ghostbloods that had been traveling with her in secret. And this is the first change that without wit, I think the entire story of the Stormlight Archive would have been forever altered. But honestly, that doesn't even compare to the third and final change to the story had wit not been there, and that is in regards to his influence on the contract Dalinar makes with Odium that leads to the Contest of Champions. See, without wit, Dalinar and pretty much everyone involved would be happy to find a way to get Odium off of Roshar. It really is only wit that pushes them to try and find a way not to allow Odium to rain chaos on the entire Cosmere. And so when Dalinar is bargaining with Odium to agree to a final contract, he brings the contract that Wit has written. Now, they don't actually agree to that contract, but Odium at this point in the story is getting frustrated with all of Roshar and offers Dalinar an unbelievable deal. Quote, "Let me finish," Odium said. "In exchange for you giving up one thing you wanted, I will give up one in turn. If I win, I will give up my grand plans for Roshar. I will leave this planet for 1,000 years and abandon all I've worked for here. I give you and the Singers freedom to make your own peace, freedom for you and freedom for me. All I want is away from this miserable system." So this is Odium essentially backing down to Dalinar and just saying, look, just let me free of this damn planet. So even if I win, I'll leave you alone for 1,000 years. And without Wit, I don't think there's any way Dalinar turns this offer down. The only reason he turns it down is because he trusts Wit more than he trusts Odium. But had Wit not been a part of the equation, I believe this would have been the end of the Stormlight Archive, and the entire story of the 5th book would have never even happened. Yes, they would still have had to deal with Odium eventually, but they would have had 1,000 more years to prepare and build upon the Knights Radiant and the technology which is already evolving exponentially. Race, win or lose, would have been gone for a millennium, never would have been confronted by Taravangian and been killed by Nightblood, so not having Wit would have had just a huge impact here. But the question I want to consider is, would that have been a preferable outcome? I mean, think about it. Yes, Odium would have been off Roshar and putting the entire Cosmere at risk, but without an army behind him. Because what ends up happening, as you know, is that Odium wins the Contest of Champions and so gets his freedom from Roshar and maintains control over his army alongside a lot of important resources, including the Blackthorn version of Dalinar. So did Wit just make things worse? Was he mostly inconsequential during the first 3 books, and then in the 4th book made the outcome worse for both Roshar himself and the entire Cosmere? Wouldn't having an easier to predict race be preferable to Taravangian for the Cosmere to have to deal with? I mean, I'm still not sure, and let me know what you think in the comments, but this whole exploration, this idea of what if Hoid was never in the Stormlight Archive? What if all he did was make the situation worse than it was already going to be? I mean, let me know, am I wrong? And if you want to know more about Hoid, make sure to check out this video where I cover how he became immortal. All right, see you next time.